This is Internet Marketing. Brought to you by SiteVisibility at sitevisibility.co.uk. This is Internet Marketing. Now, before we start today, we'd like to encourage anyone looking for help with their digital marketing to get in touch with SiteVisibility. Whether you have a burning digital marketing question or you're looking for an agency to work with, they'd love to hear from you. Give them a call, +44 1273 733 433, or fill out the form at sitevisibility.co.uk/contact. Alternatively, you can talk to either Scott or Sean via the live chat function on the site. They'd be more than happy to help. Now, today I'm joined by Andy Houstoun, Product Director at Crimtan in Brighton. Andy, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Andy. How are you?
I'm very, very well. And you're another Brighton person, aren't you? So, I could probably just use a megaphone or a long piece of hose with a funnel at both ends to do this.
Yeah.
But we're using Skype.
Yeah, we are using Skype. So it feels so I could be somewhere completely different. But, you know, in terms of the weather in Brighton, which you seem to talk about on a lot of your podcasts.
Oh, yes.
You already know, so you know I can't.
Yeah, but our listeners don't know. We've had a period of a little bit of disruptive weather, a bit of wind and rain, a little bit cooler, but recently it's got a bit warmer again. So we're now in the sort of low 20s. Last week we were in sort of the high teens, but we're away from the heat wave we had in the summer. I'm not sure if we're going to get quite to the heat wave again, but that's the meteorological sort of summary for Brighton for the last couple of weeks. But let's more interestingly, let's move on to you and what you're doing at Crimtan.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm here to talk about about dawn in programmatic display advertising. But I think before I dive in, it's probably quite a good idea to talk about actually what programmatic display advertising is.
Yeah, definitely, because that's quite a grand sort of title.
Yeah. If you don't use programmatic display advertising, as a format, it's everywhere around you. So, you know, on your day-to-day move between home and office, you're probably seeing more and more digital display boards in stations, across cities, maybe in taxis. Certainly on browsers, when you access the internet, you'll be seeing banners there, videos on social networks. Certainly, the likes of Facebook and Instagram. You'll be seeing more and more ads. So there, and on apps on mobile, there is elements of advertising. So there are lots of different types of digital display, and the world seems to be moving towards a greater digitization in advertising. With these multiple formats, there is lots of different types of content, that you might be displaying. And I guess underlying these formats that you see on a day-to-day basis is a very complex supply chain, which links back to advertisers who want to deliver the right message to the right person at the right time.
Yeah.
And this is what programmatic display is. So it uses all these formats, but the supply chain also uses a lot of data to try and make the decision and try and make the messages as relevant as possible to anyone who's looking at it. So that is, what programmatic display is, and it uses thousands and thousands of data signals. Some are related to, an ID or a user that might be looking at it at any one time, but some might not. So there are lots of very obvious data signals, time-based, weather-based. I know that's a favourite of yours, Andy. That can potentially be used to sell umbrellas or suntan lotion.
Yeah. And
ultimately, programmatic display is a very broad term that encompasses the ability to be able to do this. Now, Crimtan, we're a global company, so we've got offices in the UK, in Central Europe, in Singapore, in Japan, in Sydney. And we support advertisers to use this very complex programmatic supply chain. And our ultimate objective is to help them grow their overall customer lifetime value. Now, customer lifetime value, we'll talk about in a bit more detail later, but it's not a new thing. And for any of the marketers who are listening to this at the moment, it's about, how do I find new customers, prospect them to conversion, and then ultimately grow lifetime value by re-engaging them at the right time, at the right place, so to potentially get them to come back and engage with us more. So that's what our core objective is. And I've personally been in the digital space for over 20 years. At Crimtan, as product director, I look at developing the direction and strategy and trying to make this very complex supply chain very simple for everyone to use and benefit from. And try and deliver great value to our clients through any of the products and services that we release. Before this role, I was Chief Commercial Officer at Larsen Jennings, which is the modern Swiss-made watch brand. I was at Vendor, which was the world's largest on-demand e-commerce provider, was bought by Oracle NetSuite in 2016. So there I supported the launch and optimized lots of online propositions for the likes of Jimmy Choo, TK Maxx and Urban Outfitters. So lots of retailers in that space. Prior to Vendor, I was on the founding team of a designer fashion specialist called Kudos. The assets were bought by Net-a-Porter and trading today as The Outnet. And before that, I was a specialist omni-channel consultant at a company called Javelin Group, which was recently bought by Accenture, and helped shape digital strategies for quite a few of the FTSE 100 brands, and as well as running operational and commercial due diligence for venture capitalists and private equity firms that were looking to buy into digital businesses, at very, very high growth and early stages. And then finally, prior to that, I was part of the initial team at Tesco.com, selling groceries online and faxing orders down to stores. So I've been in and around for a bit. And I think, with the increase of digitization mentioned above, one of the things that, sort of has really come to light this year is the impact of the new legislation called the General Data Protection Regulation.
Yes.
I am sure everyone who is based within the EU or the EEA, the European Economic Area, will be very well aware of this. But it's fundamentally changing the way in which this programmatic display supply chain is being executed.
Well, I want to talk about that because, you've basically given us, by the way, it sounded like an audio CV. I was very impressed by your list of roles. Give me an idea, actually. I should do audio CVs. Anyway, I wanted to talk about, because you gave us this lovely sort of 100,000-foot view of what programmatic display advertising is. I love that term, by the way, being a sort of geek. I love anything that's automated, I just really like. But I wanted to talk about GDPR, which I can never get in the right order, standing, of course, for General Data Protection Regulation, and a few other things. But I'm just wondering, I'd say a good thing to do is let's start with a quick summary of what it is and how it's affecting, well, specifically programmatic display advertising. Okay,
so the GDPR, we call it the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It replaced the Data Protection Act of actually 1995. So there's been a number of privacy directives that have been released between now and 1995. But this really was the first piece of legislation that was looking to replace that. And I guess, just to give an idea of, how things have changed. Actually, July 1995 was the month that Amazon sold their first book online. So, the internet and the Internet of Things has changed quite dramatically since then. So, there was a real need to, I think, update, the way in which data is used because, as well as the internet changing dramatically, actually the types of data that were available has also changed dramatically. And, I think the spirit of the legislation was to try and increase the transparency to users within the European Economic Area. And I use the European Economic Area because the legislation impacts Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland too, even though they're not part of the EU. And, the spirit of the legislation was to try and increase the transparency to the data subjects about how their data and what data was used by companies based within the EEA. And I mentioned the EEA because that refers to the European Economic Area, which actually includes Liechtenstein, Norway and Iceland that aren't part of the EU. But the replacement of this Data Protection Act actually meant that, it was time to move away from personal identifiable information and start talking about this whole concept of personal data. Now, why does it impact programmatic display advertising? Well, programmatic display advertising does rely on this whole concept of online identifiers. And online identifiers fall within the scope of GDPR, which is why, as an industry, anyone working within programmatic display advertising needed to take note. So it was looking at personal data, and everyone would have read about these large fines for non-compliance. So for 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever one's higher. I mean, it's worth noting, by the way, for anyone that's listening, that actually that fine for non-compliance would only occur after a complaint or a notification and a full audit by your local data protection authority. So in the UK, that's the ICO, or the Information Commissioner's Office. But basically, GDPR identified legal means for all businesses for processing data. Now, the actual legislation identified 6. 4 were not really relevant to programmatic display advertising, but the 2 that were this concept of legitimate interests. So using data for objectives that are aligned with the end consumer. So, a really good example of this would be that a charity might be collecting data in order to inform those people that were interested in the charity if a particular donation or a particular opportunity came up to donate. You could argue that there is complete alignment between the business and the actual end data subject or user. And then the other one, really, which is the majority of programmatic advertisers have adopted, is consent. So actually asking the user up front whether or not they can use this data for the purposes of relevant advertising. So, I'm sure a lot of the listeners are web-based. You might have noticed a significant increase in the number of pop-ups appearing on sites asking for that type of permission.
We use cookies. It's interesting because it says we use cookies, blah, 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 to track you, even if you go into space. Do you accept? And you can actually, a lot of the time, you can click, no, I don't. The website just carries on anyway.
Yeah, I know. And that is a fundamental challenge, sort of that the business is facing, is that much of the consent management, i.e. the request for consent, is not actually linked with how cookies then, sort of behave on the site. And certainly one of the solutions that we've come up with for our clients is we've actually built a consent management platform that enables them to be able to capture consent, and then based on that consent, only drop the tracking or the cookies that the user has opted in for. But yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's lots of these things around, and this is all about trying to gather consent. And actually, because of the way that they've been set up, the opt-in consent has actually been around 80%. So, in terms of the impact on the programmatic display advertising network, everyone, I think, thought it would be a bit of an Armageddon. But actually, sort of users either are still confused or are just not bothered about some of the elements that, of data that are captured by programmatic agencies for the purposes of delivering relevant advertising. But I guess, that was really the core legal means that a programmatic advertiser, can have for processing this personal data. And really, the only relevant bit of personal data, or there are a few, but, the really relevant ones that are used within programmatic advertising are this whole concept of online identifier, which is stored within a cookie, and also IP addresses, which are considered, a way of being able to triangulate to, a specific user on in a specific place.
Yeah.
And then the final bit was around supporting the rights of individuals. So back to the spirit of the legislation in trying to deliver transparency. It was all about, giving a user the right to access, to correct, the right to be forgotten or erase personal data that might be stored by a business, the right to object if a business was storing data and they didn't want to and it was being done wrongly, and then the right to be notified if any of the data that is stored is breached or compromised. And businesses were legally obliged to hire or promote data protection officers within their organization to support this, and then overall data procedures. So broadly, GDPR was really about personal privacy first and asking permission for use of data.
So just remind us, how long now has GDPR, I have to say that very slowly, been around, and what's the fallout been so far?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I think the GDPR was officially implemented on the 25th of May, 2018. So this year, so a few months back. And I think, the fallout has been interesting. I don't think it's been an Armageddon to the use of personal data. And, the interpretation has been quite broad and wide. So, there is some good guidance on a number of the data protection authorities' websites, such as, ICO. But, I think the legal industry has probably had quite a good time with, being able to interpret that and decide, sort of what position each business, sort of is going to take. I mean, I think, globally, businesses are beginning to realize that any activity with any data subject within the EEA actually does mean that they have to understand what GDPR is. Classic examples are travel businesses. So travel businesses that are looking to target, users within that EEA region are going to have to make sure that they support the rights of the individuals and have a legal means for processing. Similarly, retail businesses that are looking to, sell products or services into the EEA, they're also going to have an understanding of what GDPR means. So although privacy outside the EEA has been less directly affected by GDPR, there are definite signs that privacy laws are toughening up everywhere. So there is something that is very current, and that is that there was a connection between GDPR and the US Privacy Shield. But the Civil Liberties Committee within the EU are suggesting that the US Privacy Shield is not adequate, and that connection might be severed unless the US becomes compliant within September.
Interesting.
Now, that's got fantastic impacts for any US business trying to actually work and transfer data within the EU and then transfer data outside the EU. And I think because GDPR, has been on the press quite a lot, certainly for the last 12 months, in Australia, recent statistics are showing that 80% of Australians don't like being tracked without knowing it. So clearly something's going to happen there. And I don't want to bring it up in this conversation was related to programmatic display advertising, but Brexit does also have its implications, because there are question marks over the UK's ability to meet the EU's adequacy test under data privacy. So I think GDPR was a reset button, and I think we're going to begin to see the beginnings of much tougher legislation across the world. I mean, within the EEA, there are a few things of note. I'm sure that you might notice more transparency in announcements around data breaches. So, if any of you follow any of the business news, it seems like there are more and more announcements about, potential personal data being breached by, sort of hackers.
Yeah.
And that is a direct result of a company being legally obliged to report to their DPA, in this case in the UK and in ICO, a data breach within 72 hours. So, I think that's a really positive thing. There's been some analysis around third-party tracking cookies on news sites. And actually within the UK, the amount of third-party tracking cookies has dropped quite dramatically, so by 45%. So, clearly, sort of that has had a dramatic impact on, sort of being able to follow users. And content optimization. So a lot of websites use third-party systems to try and optimize content, whether that be words or products. You might like, if you bought this, you also bought this, or recently viewed items. And, sort of actually there's been a massive cull there. So, sort of 27% or a 27% reduction in the number of cookies storing, personal data to try and optimize content. So I think, there has been a significant, impact, but, it really is, sort of just the start. And I do think that for those who tried to embrace the spirit of the legislation, there has certainly, they might feel a little bit aggrieved about some of the quite grey interpretation adopted by many, organisations across the EEA. I mean, I think in my industry, this very complex programmatic supply chain is probably more complex. There are certain big supply side providers, and I'm not going to name, them all, but, sort of they are very, very well known, high valued, tech players that are, sort of actually carving out new fiefdoms, a bit like the Game of Thrones, sort of about getting consent for people that they work with and not getting consent for, sort of people that they don't work with. So I think, hidden beneath, something that everyone would have seen, which was that, consumer facing email farce where everyone was asking for valid consent. So I'm sure you received hundreds and hundreds of emails about that.
Quite a few.
Yeah, there are millions of bits of paper being, sort of transferred between organisations to clarify their relationships, whether they're data controllers or data processors under GDPR, joint controllers, sub-processors, getting ready, to waive at, the data protection authorities in case of the dreaded audit.
Well, Andy, it's been really interesting. So we talked about GDPR. We've talked about what it means, what the fallout has been. We're going to do a part 2 because we're at about 20 minutes already, if that's all right with you, Andy. And we're going to talk in part 2. We're going to talk about some future legislation that may have been overlooked, possibly. And I also want to talk about something that you mentioned a little while ago, which is customer lifetime value and how that can be used as a sort of safeguard against the demise of the tracking cookie. So look forward to part 2. Andy, thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for listening, everyone. The show notes are in the usual place, sitevisibility.co.uk/IM podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please leave us a review. We talked about reviews a few episodes ago and how important they are, so the more reviews the better. Be honest. Hopefully they're good. Questions and suggestions go to podcast@sitevisibility.co.uk. You can tweet at SiteVisibility. We have a Site Visibility group on LinkedIn. That's all from me, this Andy. And it's all from the other Andy so far until part 2.
Well, thanks very much for listening out, and looking forward to talking a little bit more about new legislation and the challenges that we will face in part 2.
Thanks, Andy. And we'll see you next time on Internet Marketing.